Welcome to LinkedIn Live. Today's topic is redefining needs, boundaries, and self-awareness. My name is Tatiana Senikovic, and I am an HR advisor and a leadership coach. And I'm very passionate about all things leadership and mindfulness. So I support leaders in organization in finding mindful tools to navigate their personal and professional challenges and changes in a conscious and joyful way. As you watch this live, and if you'd like to know more about this topic and other leadership related topics, you can stay in touch. You can sign up for the newsletter that comes out monthly in the link below that I include in the comments, and also or join the 6-week group coaching program that I'm starting on March 7th. That's called Clarity Catalyst for Leaders, which is designed for leaders seeking to transform chaos into clear direction with ease, purpose, and joy. The link is below. And now I'm really excited to welcome Renee Deneen. Hello, Renee.
Hi.
Good to see you. We're finally doing the collaborative piece together, which I am personally really excited. And so when I introduce, Renee is an organizational psychologist and a group dynamics expert. She is very passionate about understanding human nature and inspiring others to live authentically and courageously. She is the creator of the Soulful Living Institute, a coaching and consulting platform that helps individuals and organizations live with greater purpose, joy, and grace. She has also spent 20 years in executive leadership roles in biotech and high tech, including 5 years expat assignment in Switzerland. Thank you so much for joining this topic. I know both you and I always talk about leadership. So here we are. And so I would like to jump in with the first question. You've described yourself as a recovering workaholic and doing junkie, actually. And I've watched your TEDx as well, which was super insightful. How did you first become aware that you were doing too much? And then how hard or easy was it to actually attend to that awareness? And how did you go about it?
Yeah. Well, hi, everybody. And thank you so much for having me. I'm glad this conversation finally happened. Some just good things just take time. So hopefully this message meets the right listeners who could take some nuggets of either truth or inspiration into their own journey. So that's my wish. So I think I've always known that I was addicted to busy, kind of really proud, in fact, of being able to do a lot of things without a lot of suffering. And by
Mm,
that, I mean, I always just assumed that, oh, well, somehow I have the capacity to do more, to hold more, to achieve more, to dream more. I was really raised in a self help environment that told me, you can manifest anything that you desire. If it's to be, it's up to me. Where there's a will, there's a way, right? All of these like mantras are like wired into my brain from a pretty young age. And for the most part, those mantras did serve me and continue to serve me today, but until they don't. And I think when I realized that my doing addiction to the doing became too much, and trust me, there were so many other warnings that I ignored
mm,
because it was so anchored to my identity. So for those of you who like to do and get things done and that you take joy and pride in that, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about why it's hard to break it.
yeah.
I see you. I absolutely see you. And at some point, I have yet to meet someone who resonates with being a doing addict. And I name doing as an addiction very tenderly. And what I mean by that is, your doing life has you, you don't have it. And that may either because you lack awareness or you lack eventual suffering that happens from doing too much.
Mm,
So once I was aware, I started to have a stutter. I had a tremor in my hand. My doctor thought I had MS and got an MRI, and thankfully I didn't. So I had basically overrided my body so many times that it was showing up, in unhealthy ways, potentially really unhealthy ways. And so I think that was my kind of more critical wake up call. But there were many before that I just sort of turned the volume down on. And then I started to look at my life, my relationships, my relationship to sleep, my presence with my family and kids, how tired I always was,
mm.
not able to be present, and realize that this was no longer serving me in the ways that I had thought. So I had to come to grips with that. And speak my truth around it.
And so what I'm hearing exactly the how hard or easy, it's like the self-awareness piece, what you mentioned, and is it was kind of there were the kind of the signs along the way, but it gets to a place where just some things break down. And that definitely happens as you bring it up in terms of health, is having some clients as well, and who mentioned it's like they end up in the hospital. And I always tell like, is that what it takes? Um,
Hmm.
just and somewhere where the other things that you also mentioned, I think the part is that whether people become self-aware or the suffering, becomes so
Mm.
painful. It's just
Yeah,
so great. And that's kind of the cusp where I wish for everybody to become more self-aware much faster than the suffering catching up. Uh,
right. I would love that too. And we're
the
going to get
body
into the
doesn't break down. Yeah.
absolutely. And the world isn't going to do this work for you. The world loves doers. I mean, people who can get things done, who say yes, who don't know how to say no. Like some people really love those people. So it's definitely a journey you have to choose to take.
Absolutely.
It's been super worthy for me. Yeah, one of the
And
best ones I've.
it's exactly what you're bringing up as well, is that what's rewarded around us as well, and that's the
Right.
piece that it. And you mentioned about the identity, and yeah, the addiction is the piece. It's I was like, I could have said it. I was like, sure, I could be doing junkie. It definitely was before, because it feels good. You're right,
Mhm.
like that. It's the same endorphins
It's a
coming in,
fix.
where
It's a
it's like
fix,
it
and you get that
feels
fix in
good.
it.
Everybody around you loves everything that you do, but at the end of the day, as I can totally resonate with you, is that I'm tired, actually cranky. Like, is this the way I want to show up with my relationships? And it's like, no, something's got to change. So in that
And when you
regard,
realize you're not in alignment anymore with your truest intentions, it's
yes.
really hard to then keep going on that path. If you're an aware person, that's why I think awareness is first and foremost for anything you want to change, the first really important step.
Why do you think it's so? I mean, we touched a little bit, but why do you think it is so hard for people to stop doing, or just break that very direct correlation with big to do things, and the kind of the worthiness piece
Yeah.
or
In
acceptance?
my TED Talk, and I would say I fall a bit into all of these, but certainly some are more prominent. I name 5 types of doers,
Mhm.
and really getting underneath your motivation to do. So there's the achieving doer, there is the supporting doer, the controlling doer, the avoiding doer, and the perfecting doer. And so if you can kind of get underneath, for me, the avoiding doer, it's like the busier I am, the easier it is to avoid the bigger questions, the bigger callings, like where that voice in you says there's something else for you, or this isn't working for you, right? That you've turned down for so long.
Mhm.
As long as I can keep going and keep that buzz and that sort of fix active,
Yeah.
I can tone those down enough where they don't rip me apart. And finally, when I got still, and that required me in those moments, and I had planned, everyone's like, did you have to leave corporate? I'd planned eventually to do it anyway, but this was a moment for me. I thought this is the time. And as soon as I got slow, that white place emerged on my calendar, and where I was coming into choice again around what gets on and what doesn't. I really started to hear voices, internal voices, internal desires that had long been there but had been tuned out. And I just started to get super curious about them. So
Mm.
that was for me. And I think the achieving doer is commonplace society wise. Right? We like people who get things done. It feels good to achieve. But at the end of the day, enough needs to be enough. And for me, my mantra became what I've done, what I have, and who I am is already enough. It's already enough. So then what else? If I get clear about who I am, then what else is there for me to do? And equally important, what is not mine to do either anymore, or maybe never was.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, our need for perfection, our need to control, those are all motivators to do.
Yeah, I really appreciate the 5 types, and you were mentioning them. I was like, yeah, I have like a bit of all of them. Depends, like exactly what's the motivation behind actually a certain action. Some of them are to avoid something, some of them to like procrastinate, some of them is like there's the action or the achieving piece. It's like, oh yeah, if I do this, like I see the reward very clearly, or to get
Right.
rewarded. And so I think the other piece you mentioned is which I want to highlight, is that it's that intentional creation of space that you mentioned, right? So it's sometimes, and even working with clients, I think we probably have those as well, is that you don't have to leave. I mean, to me, it's like you don't have to leave the job or corporate, or you're running your own business is just as full of a plate. But how do we create the spaciousness and the places where the mind, that white space, as you call it, to be like, what am I doing? How am I doing? Like, what's happening for me right now? And that to me doesn't matter whether you work in corporate, you don't work in corporate. It's like, how intentional are you about that space? Yeah.
And I think I mean, the smallest of things, I know that you're really big into mindfulness. And I find sometimes, like, you go out to dinner and you have a friend or a couple or whatever, and they speak a lot, right? And you're like, oh, I don't think they asked one question, or like, I don't know what that was, and it's like, all you need to do is mindful, like, oh, step back into my body, be here now. Like, it's a small invitation that we're offered every single moment of every single day that we often don't take. But if you decide to be conscious, everything changes. And as soon as you live consciously, you make the harder choices for your life, even if that means unraveling or re-welcoming new or old identities.
Can you touch a bit, as you just mentioned right now, the unraveling or revisiting the old identities, and that you mentioned before too, the avoiding certain things. I think humans, in my experience, myself included, that avoiding piece of that old identity or pain or something is so strong a lot of times that it really prevents us from actually living, as you say, to what are your dreams, in a sense, what do you care for? Can you touch a bit more on, not in a way how to not be afraid of that, but maybe how to navigate it in some ways, because it'll come, it's there.
Some will call it a midlife crisis. I call it just an awakening. It's like, some jobs you're in and what you're up for. Some jobs really do require you to be 100% available, work the hours, etc. Most jobs, there's flex. And there's a whole lot of inefficiency that happens too, right? So getting that cleaned up is helpful in and of itself. But I think at that point when you're starting to wake up every day, and maybe the desire, like, you're not loving it anymore. Like those small things, like, oh, this is harder to get up. Or you're in a meeting and you're looking around and you're like, I kind of want to be anywhere but here, right? These little small, like, maybe it's time for a change. But what I think we fail in those moments, like, because if we're not changing, by the way, we're dead. So change is good, necessary, and sometimes difficult. But I think it's this believing really wholeheartedly that you know yourself best, that you are here to serve a unique purpose, and that your dreams and your desires are valid, and that as much as possible that you feel like you have agency to claim those. And yes, they're easier at some points than others. For sure, I'm at a point in my life where I have, freedom, grace, joy is something I can choose every day. And yet bad things will still happen. But I think it's this idea of not falling into the belief or the mindset or the rhetoric that your self-sacrificing your health and well-being is necessary to thrive. That's a lie. It's a flat out lie.
Yeah, I'm absolutely. The part, that is not as a direct, like, it's not one or the other.
That's right. That's right. And also, no one's going to draw that line for you. No one's going to. And if they are, they're co-enabling. It's not healthy anyway. If they're like, oh, let me help you do this. It's like, who am I there for? What am I to do? What are my boundaries? What are my needs? What do I love? What am I not okay doing? And knowing that you have choice and agency, I think if you're leaving this conversation, that would be like, you have choice, you have agency. It's worth the search for it.
Absolutely. And you touch on boundaries, which I want to come back to, but I also want to mention for everybody who's watching, if you put a question in the comments, we will see it and we'll happily address it. So go ahead and do that. So as you just touched on boundaries, and that's exactly as you were speaking about the sense of agency and the communication around it. Why is it so hard to set boundaries at work or in life in general? And is there a difference? And what
Mhm.
are the mindsets and beliefs about and around that?
So I think if you've always struggled with boundaries, meaning um, that you're clear what's okay and not okay for you.
Mhm.
And that can be small things like having your phone on and being available to be text 24 hours a day by work. If that's okay with you and that truly is okay with you, fantastic. If it's not, right, then what is okay? Please don't, like I used to when I was working full time and intense, I was like, I don't take calls from 6 to 9.
Yep.
That was it. And then after 9 to 11, I'm happy to do that, or even sometimes later because we were working around the globe. So that was a boundary that I could set and people respected it. But what's hard about it is, first and foremost, if you don't know what your boundaries are and you're in the habit of letting other people determine what your boundaries are, or you're in the habit of letting sort of like a culture of a company or the temperament of a boss to set those boundaries for you, it's hard. And the other thing that's hard about boundaries is that sometimes I believe we think if I set a boundary, they won't like it, as if we're responsible for their reaction to our boundary. And I think as soon as we say, oh, that is someone who doesn't want to honor my boundaries, and please be realistic. I don't mean like I'm only working this. I mean,
Yeah,
most
exactly.
jobs aren't that fixed. But
Yeah.
I think once you realize that a no will be respected, that a no is always an option, that setting boundaries is the best way to teach people how to work with you. It's honest, it's authentic, and it's inspiring. And the more that we learn to set boundaries, what I have found in my life, the more that I learn to set boundaries and even name them, like, oh, that's a boundary for me, and I could say why, but I'm open if that's not going to work, right? You don't become rigid and inflexible. Then I inspire other people to do that too. And I think as leaders, that's to me a core mastery skill of leadership is to know their own boundaries, to honor those in others, and to make it boundaries not the issue that the best work doesn't get done. That's just not why it doesn't. It gets, if work isn't happening in the way that you want it, or you're not getting it done, you're either lacking focus, lacking resource, lacking capability. It isn't because you set a boundary. And
Mhm.
so don't let anyone or any context tell you that you shouldn't have boundaries because you work here or you get a paycheck. That's just also another lie. So please don't believe it.
No, thank you for all of that piece about boundaries. And one thing you mentioned that just kind of comes in conversations more and more with me is that part of the rigid versus flexible is.
Yeah.
I also noticed that with people experiences that don't have very clear understanding of their own boundaries, once they start learning them, it becomes a bit rigid. It's kind of pendulum. I always describe it as sometimes like if we're on one side, a lot of times as humans we swing to the other side, kind of to the another extreme than to find the equilibrium. And so
Yeah.
I wanted to point out here is that exactly sometimes it feels rigid, and just remembering that as you set a boundary doesn't mean you can't change your mind later,
Yeah.
or
Absolutely.
change it, or change that piece. But it is really important. That's exactly what I've, with the team before, I would say that helps me know how to work with you,
Yeah.
in a sense, whatever that might be, then I can own my response, how I feel, like whatever that is. But at the end of the day, it really helps me identify and understand my team and colleagues and whoever else.
Yeah.
Is there a
And I don't
difference?
want to,
Go
you
ahead.
have me, you have me thinking there's a question about
Yeah.
boundaries in the chat, but I think some people say, oh, are men better or women better? I think both men and women, all genders, struggle with boundaries because it just hasn't been something that's been well modeled. And when it's been well modeled, it was so rigid, right? It was
Yes.
so rigid and there was consequence to it that we almost got a bad taste. So, I've
Mhm.
really reinvented this word boundaries, talking about it in teams and just entering a dialogue and sometimes a negotiation. A boundary is connected to a need. And if leaders can lead from there, I have a need to, and therefore, right? What well-intentioned, rational human being is going to call you out on that? And also, don't have boundaries around everything. Don't be a rigid person. That's not what I'm suggesting. But you deserve to have your core boundaries and values honored and your needs met. And boundaries are a way to ensure that not only your needs are met, but then you're able in return to reciprocate that for others.
And I think as needs is one of the pieces that we're kind of weaving through, is that's exactly, it's like, if you don't communicate about your needs, therefore through boundaries and the other ways of communication, then you can't meet them, or they can be met. But I think another
unspoken
I
one.
want to highlight here, I think with your statement, when a leader says, I have a need, and therefore would you whatever the behavior request is, it's an ownership. It's back to that sense of autonomy, but also ownership of like, I need this, I'm not projecting, I'm not demanding, can you meet me? And again, it's right, I really appreciate the word negotiation. It is always that, in like, for ourselves internally and with the people.
Yeah.
And I want to read the question from Eric. Thank you so much. What's an effective way to lead our leaders who don't respect boundaries due to corporate culture? Lead by example, more than that. What's your thoughts?
Well, as soon as I get my current Soulful Living book published, I'm writing another one called Tolerance Breeds Toxicity. I mean, in a culture with leaders who don't respect boundaries, that's toxic. And that's typically not a one-off. It's a systemic behavior that's been tolerated, and it leaves people feeling helpless. And helplessness is not what you want from your people, period, full stop, And so we want what we want. And leaders are no different. Even the most aware leaders, want things done, and we all sort of have a preference. And so I think, to just answer the question most explicitly, what do? Is you say, that isn't going to work for me. Let's have a conversation. Or here's another option I have. Or, as you know, I'd like to be home. We've talked about this with my family from 6 to 9, unless it's urgent. Of course, please then say, hey, I absolutely need you. Something's happening, right? There's a business risk at hand in this moment. But for the most part, HR, senior leadership, a board, whatever type of context you're in, shouldn't tolerate people not honoring people's boundaries. It's just, it's a form of corporate abuse.
I was going to say it's a form of abuse.
Yeah, I mean, we abuse our power as leaders. I say, therefore you should, and no one wins. I can tell you right now, if you're resonating with this as a leader, I see you. You have this. I know it's not your truest intent to do that, but you'll never be that legacy leader that people follow somewhere else. You'll never be the one they talk about, wow, the best leader. And so if that's important to you, know that leaders who don't respect boundaries of other people, whether that be personal or professional, are not legacy leaders. You're never going to be great. If you want to be great, get to know your people, understand the why, the needs behind their boundaries. And in the context of what you do, figure out how both can be met, the needs of the business and the needs of your people.
I'd also, exactly, the highlighting piece is that nobody wins in it. And I do believe in the win-win situations and scenarios, like where to find that middle. But exactly as you were highlighting the toxicity part. So thank you for that.
Let me offer one other thing too, because I don't want to be flippant. Sometimes we love the job, we don't love the leader, and that happens all the time. And so I'm not saying everyone can just leave. That is always an option, by the way. You could always leave a toxic culture.
Right.
And I think for most of us who love what we do and are committed to our work, we'd like to try to change it first. So for those listening and that are in that kind of culture, I just encourage you to try to change it with modeling, yes, asking the question, entering negotiation conversations. What's a need you have? Okay, well, here's a need I have. How do we both get that met? And again, well-intentioned, rational human beings, if they don't respond to that type of invitation to have a conversation, unfortunately shouldn't be leading. I mean, they're hurting people.
How long can you, that's back to the health, actually. I have a client actually right now with a very toxic leader. It's like, how long can you be in this situation, and at what expense? That's always a question for me. At what expense? And no, it's not for everybody. No, leave right now. But do understand, just like you said, if you've done every possible communication way, and the person is not willing to meet you anywhere,
and the company's not willing to advocate for a different behavior, Right.
Exactly. So it's like what you do have choices. It doesn't have to be like slamming the door and walking away, but it is a piece of reflection to be like,
Yeah.
okay, then what now?
What
Because
are
it's
my
from,
options?
yeah, what are my options and how do I show up for myself and do this mindfully, but do like, what am I gonna, how am I gonna change this world?
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
for that.
I stay with it. I see you, and also my heart goes out to you. It's really rough to work in a
Yeah,
toxic
that's a
place.
rough one. And I think as you mentioned too, it's like when you actually really love the job, right? And
Yeah.
it's really, and it's like, and again, we all know people don't leave companies, they leave managers, they leave the leaders, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just like, oh, come on,
Yeah.
there's that
Yeah.
piece.
That's not a shadow anyone wants to cast. So
No.
lose-lose. It's a lose-lose.
In that direction, what do you think are the greatest challenges facing leaders today, or at least one big one? And I know you work a lot with women as well. So is there a difference, for genders in terms of like actually in terms of that you notice in your work with leaders, or it's kind of
Yeah.
like one big challenge for everybody?
I think that the biggest challenge leaders face, men, women, all sorts, all of us in all contexts, is to stay human. To look at
Mhm.
that person across from you as a full-fledged human being who's, for the most part, is showing up trying to do the best they can. And they have a whole history, a whole life. I mean, leadership program I'm really honored to be a part of out of IMD in Switzerland is called High Performance Leaders. And really, the first day it asks the question, what happened to you? What
Mhm.
happened to you? And we tackle topics such as our whole life stories, but we also go into the harder places, trauma, grief, loss. Um, do you know why you lead? Who are your leaders? Are you modeling the type of leadership that reflects truly who you are, and asking these bigger, deeper questions? And I think that for leaders today, it's real. I mean, like with AI, I mean, there's so many things happening all the time. I don't want to name one. We could blame COVID forever, but let's not. Like all these things, like stay human, look at your people and say, I am human, you are human. I want to know you. I want you to thrive. I want you to know me. I want to thrive. And spend the time, take the genuine interest in getting to know who's sitting across from you, what happened to them, how they came to be, and how you can make this, for each other, a good part of your life. And we're not going to make that easy. That's not easy because it takes time and it takes genuine interest and it takes vulnerability. So
I think it also takes what you mentioned earlier about you kind of diving deeper into yourself, is it takes curiosity.
that's
It
right.
takes that inquisitiveness and curiosity, like genuinely being curious about the person across
Yeah.
work, life, whatever that is. It's like, do you genuinely care to understand and hear where that person comes from?
Yeah.
We're going to be having a couple more questions. So if anybody has any questions before we wrap up, plop them into the comments. But in terms of that reflection, to tie it in, how has your career evolved to allow you to do this deeper work? Because you are a very reflective person.
Yeah. I mean, I started in corporate. I mean, it was 1995. I was in the heart of the Silicon Valley. I got my master's degree in org psych and I worked for high tech. I mean, I had no boundaries between work and life. And it was San Francisco was at its best. I mean, there was a lot of really good things going on that I'm just so grateful for, and I just cherish. And in that sort of hustle, um, you don't get enough time to pause, reflect, drop in, ask the bigger questions, be with the deeper reflections. And so, but that was always in me because I did grow up in this self-help. So over time, I started to feel empty in the work, even though I knew I was, uplifting a leader or helping someone resolve a conflict or driving a change that brought business success and people could get excited about, like, it wasn't deep. And so I started to just play with the deeper work in different communities outside of corporate. And then I started to really bring those deeper level of questions and curiosity into my conversations, and magic just started to happen. And I thought, I can't do it any other way. And so
Mm.
I may not be for everybody, right? I do ask big questions. People say, oh, Renee's coming, get your tissues out, because I think what we feel we can heal, what we feel we can change. And so I'm not afraid to go there one bit. What I would say, being an internal org psychologist and coach, was harder to do that deeper work. So when I left, that gave me a lot of freedom and objectivity to be able to be with the full human experience and the group dynamic, and be able to just like see what was happening and crystallize things and hold up mirrors in a very tender and safe way. By the way, you need safety first, sort of, you need caring and safety first, and then you can dare away. And then I just started to follow those desires that I had for who I was in this work, and how I wanted to impact the world, and how I wanted to be with myself in my work. And then the deeper work started to come to me. So I'm moving into an exciting chapter where that's really all the work I'm going to be doing, is people who really want to do that deeper excavation, and it feels like a moment in their time when they can. And I do that mostly with group work and women's retreats, but also with some of my clients. I mean, they've really stepped up. When you ask the question and they feel safe, they show up in that work and they get something deeply from it. So that keeps me going.
Oh, yeah. That's beautiful, because you mentioned a couple of things that I just want to connect. It's the safety piece is absolutely essential, and creating space, and then that depth, that sometimes it does help having someone on our side who can support us into just kind of diving in and holding that. It's going to be okay. So it's a beautiful piece. And the last one out of this point of yours is that I was doing a project in the company, and somebody asked me as a consultant, and they said, well, would you ever go back as an HR executive in the company? And it was a COO. And I looked at him, and it's politely, in a way, I was just like, I wouldn't be able to tell you what I'm telling you right now if I worked in this company, because I would be reporting to you, actually, because the way the structure in that company was. And I said, it's not the same. And I said, and the freedom, but also like that passion and the ability to put all these puzzles together in a very mindful, but really like, here you go. This is really important for you to know way. You can't do it internally when you work internally, because there's all of this piece.
And when you choose to do that deeper work, you'll lose some clients. And now I realize sometimes, it's like, oh, I know this is important, but this culture, or I just can't go there. And so I might do other work with them, like create leadership experiences or something. But I honor that. I see that. I don't force it at all. It's an invitation. It's always an invitation.
Yeah, that brings also safety, I think. So as we wrap this up, what's one thing that you want our listeners to walk away with, maybe, or to remember?
I would like anyone listening in to pause a moment after we get off the live and just step into their agency and be like, what choices do I have? Where do I have choice in my life? Because the more that we can claim those choices, whether they're good or bad, they could be, I'm choosing to stay here with a toxic boss, but it's out of choice. Like it just brings an element of ease and acceptance to whatever situation you're in. You don't need to feel bad about sticking around, right? But you should be in choice around it. So you always have choice. You always have agency. And most people are still good, rational, well-intentioned human beings. And when we can meet our needs, when we can enter a difficult negotiation or conversation at the need level, most will honor that. And that's good enough. Most will honor that.
I really appreciate it. I think for me, from our conversation, the one thing, and I see Eric actually popped another question. The one thing to remember is create space, people. Like, just like as you actually said after the call, take a moment. It's like, put those moments on your calendar, create space, because it will get filled if you don't.
It absolutely will.
And that's about the boundary. It's back to our boundary piece, is that it comes to your time, space, or any of that, is that that would be, but create that space so then you can breathe, you can reflect, you can have a pause, you can think what my options are. Without that space and pause, we are just in the default and drive, and that
the habitual response. Reactiveness. Well, we didn't talk about my TED Talk, but in there I name a practice called authentic inaction. And it's just noticing those small but important moments in our life when we have time to choose. Just, it could be a second, it could be a day, depending on the decision. But really, that's a practice, and it takes a muscle to just. I sometimes will close my eyes and just give me a minute. Let me decide. So it's not. The practice isn't difficult, but the rewiring of the mindsets that keep the
Muscle.
practice at bay is the real work. So once you've done that,
Yeah. It's the muscle, which is exactly it ties. Now I can call it. I'll be like, that's Renee's authentic in action. And
connection muscle.
I'm like, pause, people, and breathe. Like, do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
The last question, and then we'll wrap it up. How can an individual without the org psychology background promote within their larger organization the need to appreciate and benefit of that deeper work, which is such a cornerstone to balance of individuals and organizations?
Oh gosh, that's a big question.
I know, it's like, wow.
You know, it's hard. So now you are aware, now you are responsible. It's really hard when you're the one that's aware that there's a deeper being within you, aware that there's a toxicity that's harming people, aware that there's not authentic connection in your organization or linkage to the mission that's in a way where it's honoring the needs, boundaries, and passions and desires of the employees. When you're the only one aware, it's exhausting. And you can't make someone be aware, but what you can do is ask bigger questions. Tell me more about your decision. What about your history informs that decision? Or I saw you said that, but you did that. And I'm just curious, right? So it is being willing to have the courage to start asking the bigger questions. And then for those of us that are doing the work, the real deep work to transform and come into our full-fledged human beingness and our full potential and honoring our passions and purposes, share your story. Don't be afraid to say, I went to this experience, or whether it's a therapist you had that opened you up or a deep workshop, go back and share your story. People will see you light up, see your heart crack open a bit more, see your generosity and your authenticity, and they will want some of it. And then many of them may not, and you just can't force it. It's just.
I really appreciate it because exactly, Eric, it's great and deep question, but like I don't have the academic org psychology background, but the background and experience, and it's literally what I was thinking. If the big group is too unsafe, you start with connecting with certain individuals, and you start sharing, just like what you're saying. Hey, I learned this, and you'll find your people, how I would say, and slowly, it definitely I had a role. I was an HR exec, so I could move this stuff a little in bigger, with bigger impact. But I think on a personal level, it's starting that web and connection and sharing. You start sharing. Exactly.
There's a quote, and I won't get it perfect, but I love it. Never doubt the power of a few citizens to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. It starts with a small group of people who are more aware and awake in their life and in their bodies, and more connected to their purpose and their source. And they start to have conversations, and they start to meet those people. And I think it will surprise you when you share your story. They'll share theirs.
It's the vulnerability and the safety and the trust is created. This is a beautiful way to wrap this up. So at the end, how can people find you, where they can find you, what other work you would like to share before we close this?
Yeah, I just launched my new website. It has everything. I had a retreat website, and then I had an authentic in action for my TED Talk website. So they're all in one under Renee Deneen. My TED Talk's on the TED platform. And so it's easy to find there as well. And then just something deep on my heart right now is I'm curating my 3rd year Soulful Living Retreat for women, honoring authentic and conscious connection. And it's in Costa Rica, July 27th to August 1st. And I have about 3 beautiful accommodations left. It's going to be a beautiful week, and you can learn more on my website.
And we have a common friend who attended one of your retreats, and she absolutely just was raving about it. So I'm really excited that happened and thrilled. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon. Again, if you want to stay connected, sign up for the newsletter, check out the course in the comments. I'm delighted to have this really impactful, I think, and really important conversation.
Yeah. Thanks for the invitation. Bye, everybody.
Bye.